If you don't look back on your previous work and cringe a little bit, then you're not improving.
And that is Lee Robinson, the VP of Product at Vercel, and also, if I may say, the face behind Next.js. From creating content after hours to becoming the VP of Developer Experience as well as later on Product at Vercel, these journeys started off with a very simple goal: to make the web better and to make Next.js easier to understand for developers worldwide.
Ultimately had to make this bet of the React team has some ideas about where they want to take this server and client model in the future. We can kind of go all in and go on this wild ride, or we could build a 1.1 instead of a 2.0. Just a 1.1, it's a layer of the pages router model, and we wanted to take a big swing.
And that swing, it changed how millions of developers build for the web today. Today, companies like Netflix Jobs, Spotify, Zapier, Claude AI, OpenAI, all use Next.js in production. And this wouldn't be possible without Lee or Lee's teams that are working super hard to make React as well as Next.js better for everyone. In this candid conversation, we are going to talk about the evolution of Next.js and why Next.js made some controversial but necessary architectural changes.
I think one thing that we've learned, certainly on the Next.js team, from the React team, is designing and building APIs, not for your existing users, but for future users. And it's kind of a mind-bending concept because you would think, well, of course I want to bring everybody who's currently using the framework along for the ride, and we do, but when you're designing APIs from scratch, we're thinking about the next million developers.
The future of web development with partial pre-rendering and streaming.
We think that the streaming model is so impactful for helping you improve core web vitals, improve the user experience of your application, that we think it should be the default way that you build web applications.
These practical approach in building performant applications and how you can do the same.
And from Vercel's point of view, that's great. I don't think every Next.js application in the world should work on Vercel. If you want to self-host it somewhere else, that's awesome.
Lee's leadership philosophy and his personal journey from developer to the VP of product and so much more. So let's dive in. Thank you so much, Lee, for coming on my channel. And yeah, just this conversation. I'm really excited. To start off the interview, I would love for you to introduce yourself for those who don't know you already, haven't had the privilege to know you yet, but I'm sure there are very few people like that. But anyway, please continue introducing yourself.
Yeah, hey everyone, I'm Lee, or Lee Rob online, and I am a product engineer, community builder, general open source lover, Next.js fanboy, and I have been building on the web for the majority of my career. It's been the one thing that I really love in terms of programming. And I work at Vercel. I've been at Vercel for about 4.5 years now. Joined when we were a very small company, and now we've grown up a little bit. And I work on Next.js and try to teach our community of developers about how it works, about the new things we're releasing, and help them understand how to build great products with it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. I'm a huge fan of your work. As you probably already know, I've been like DMing you over the years. But fun fact, I think when I was trying to pitch Next.js in my company is when I reached out to you.
Nice.
And you were the one who, I guess, like taught me server-side rendering in a way that I truly understand, and I still have that mental model. So thank you so much for doing that.
That's awesome to hear. I'm glad I could be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I also came across your content through your YouTube channel, but obviously through mastering Next.js as well. So I would love to know about, how did you get, I guess, into Vercel, or just overall your journey into just creating more content, because I know that you were creating a lot of like free resources for the community. And then that's how I discovered you. So yeah, I would love to know more about your journey.
Yeah, I think broadly going back, I have always been the type of engineer who wanted to do more than just code. And it's not that I didn't like coding, I love coding. But the other parts of building a product were fascinating to me. When I was younger, I had a brief stint with graphic design, and I've always liked writing. And I, over my career, had not really found the right way of kind of putting all of those skills together into one thing. But at the last company I worked for before Vercel, we were in the process of moving from a custom React application over to something else. And myself and others on the team at the time did the evaluation and determined actually Next.js would be a good fit for this. And this was very, very early in Next.js. It had just been a few versions came out. It didn't nearly have any of the adoption. And when I was going to learn more about it and start this process of migrating our application, I searched on Google, I looked around, I read the docs, and it didn't really have the stuff that I needed. A lot of the questions that I was asking, I couldn't find answers online. And being the type of person that I am, I said, okay, well, I'm just going to make it then. Somebody else is going to find value from this. And they're going to say, wow, I'm glad that this resource existed online because I had that exact same question. So as we went through the process of moving this application over to Next.js, I wrote blog posts about how to use different features of Next.js and the different rendering methods and how to think about the framework, why I found it to be easier than setting my own React application from scratch, and just really started to learn about every bit of the framework. And over time, that turned into a body of things where I decided to put it together in more of a guided resource or a course, because I had started to get some positive feedback from people online when I would share my work. And they said, this was actually very helpful. We'd love to hear more content about Next.js or React. So in my, 5 to 9 p.m. at night, after hours, after my day job, I would start working to teach people how the framework worked and to create content on my YouTube and on Twitter and such. And I had been doing that for a few years when the Next.js team reached out to me and they said, we see you in the community building stuff all the time. It seems like you have a pretty good understanding of how the framework works and how to teach it. We're wanting to grow the team and we could probably use somebody doing the work that you're doing full time. Now, at the time, Vercel was about 30 people, so pretty small. And generally the people who were coming on were doing a lot of things more than just what their job was. Small startup, had to kind of wear a lot of different hats, a lot of different roles. So when I got started at Vercel, I was definitely teaching people about Next.js, but I was also helping out with sales, and I was joining on calls to teach people about Vercel's platform, and I was helping out with marketing and just kind of all over the board, which was honestly really fun. It's, haven't looked back since then.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like you were wearing a lot of different hats, which also gives you so much more empathy into the role that you are in right now, right? With the community and overall, I would say developer experience too, because you know what each person is thinking about. Not like obviously everything, but you can sort of tell what each person is thinking about, so you can sort of connect the dots and help them where they are at, which is pretty awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess you started off in Vercel in developer experience, and then you slowly transitioned to being a director and then a VP of product. Is that right? So how did that journey into senior leadership, how did you transition? Because a lot of folks that are probably watching would probably want to get to where you are. Being in senior leadership in the past myself, I know it's not easy per se to climb the ladder. You have to show that impact, and which you clearly did. But I would love to know how you transition and how you found that transition as well.
So when I got started, I was basically building our developer relations, developer experience team from the start. So it was just me working with other people at Vercel, trying to set a good example of the team that I wanted to build. And pretty quickly within that first year, once I started to do this work more full-time and focus just on DevRel type work, I knew that I needed to hire more people. Otherwise, I wasn't going to be able to keep up with the amount of things that I wanted to get done. So one of the things that I think I did a good job of early on was hiring and growing a team, and specifically finding people who maybe didn't come from traditional backgrounds to be in roles that would actually work very well in growing a community and teaching people about the framework. Some of the folks went to medical school and then decided to drop out and learn how to code. Some of the others were fresh out of college and just excited to work with new technology. And I'm really grateful to all of them for taking a chance on joining Vercel and helping build out this thing of teaching our community about how everything works. And, some of them obviously still are on the team today. And over time, that kind of grew and expanded in scope to where then I also started working with our documentation team. There was a lot of parallels between the work that we were doing in DevRel and the work that we were doing in documentation. And it just made a lot of sense for us to work much closer together. So at that point, when I was taking on more scope, I was managing more people. I was having more influence over the company. I, moved up into a higher role at the company and generally just had more responsibility for the work that we were doing, which, like you said, it's great. There's lots of positives with it. There's also a lot of hard things, and there's a lot of things that I've learned and I'm sure I would do differently if I could do it over again. A lot of firsts for me as well. This is the first time I've ever been a VP at a company somewhere, and I have definitely made mistakes and learned from some of those mistakes. To be really specific, one that I'm thinking about a lot right now is after kind of going from developer to VP and hiring my team and growing my team and focusing on different parts of helping Vercel be successful, it's very easy to go back to being a individual contributor to help put out fires, to help solve issues, because that's what I know how to do well. That's what comes easy to me in a lot of ways, is like, no, I'll do it. I'll help fix it. Just let me take the thing. I'll do it. But the only way that you grow a great team who can help solve problems together with you is you have to spend a lot more time on hiring and growing the team and kind of cultivating learning and development on the team. And I'm kind of back in that mode now. I've realized there's a lot more that I want to do in terms of hiring and growing the team, and I'm spending a lot more time on that versus just, making my own things as well. So that's
Yeah, for sure. I guess like it's always like, oh, let me just fix this one thing right now, and then I will show you how I did it.
Yeah.
Versus it's just like, you fix it. I'll be here to guide you. This way definitely pays off later on as well, as you see people grow too.
definitely.
Yeah. That's awesome to hear your experience throughout. And it sort of shows like if you were to create like good impact in the company and sort of not just be, I would say, only a developer, right? Although a developer does do a lot. But when you sort of like wear different hats and sort of take on different roles, collaborate with other cross teams, I feel like your impact slowly grows. And I think it really helps with not just now at Vercel, but eventually in the future too. You have that skill set now, which is like amazing, which a lot of developers should learn from for sure.
Yeah, I think there's two things that have helped me be successful at Vercel. And I think one of them was a little bit on me and the other one was kind of completely out of my control. The one that was on me is I actually don't know the best way for people to find this other than trying a lot of things. But I found the intersection of things that I really like to do and that I wake up every day motivated to do, and the things that I think that I'm pretty good at. And when those two things align, it's very much a force of you are motivated and excited about the work that you're doing. And generally, I think that helps you just create better work. So that was the one that was kind of in my control. The one that was out of my control that I give a lot of credit to Vercel for, first is for Guillermo taking a chance on hiring me. I mean, I, on paper, was not the right person for this job. You would look at my background and you're like, I don't know if he's the person who's going to start the team, but he seems really excited and seems really dedicated to this. So we're going to take a chance and see how it works. And I'm really grateful to him for doing that and providing leadership, as well as other leaders that I've had along the way. Kevin, Hank, others, Tomo, shout out to all of them. They have all in different ways helped me grow as an individual, helped me refine what it meant for me to be a leader, what it meant to grow a team, what it meant to, do performance reviews, give hard feedback, go through some of the tough times as well. And all of that, I think, has helped me become much more rounded in what I'm doing, more than just coding or being just a developer.
For sure. And that's awesome when you have that community, right? That of like, I would say cheerleaders to sort of help you grow as well as an individual. So that's awesome to see that for sure. Next.js has grown so much over the past few years. And as you know already, I love Next.js. Majority of the videos on my channel are dedicated to it. I have a course on it. So it's like, I really love the framework overall. But I would love to know what are some of the challenges that I guess you have come across over the years, especially in the world of developer experience overall. Because I feel like as a community, as a tech community overall, we are also sort of defining what developer experience even means. You have wrote a really good blog post on that topic, which I use as a reference whenever I'm talking to any clients in general. Thank you for doing that. But I would say, what are some of the challenges that you've had to face over the years as you grow this massive community, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, it's a good question. When you're growing a community of developers using a product, namely an open source product, which I think is more difficult, they have a lot of opinions. And honestly, most of the time they're right. Like most of the time, the general consensus of people in the community is directionally correct on what's going well or what's not going well. The caveat to that is that they don't always have the right solution to the problem. They're right with the pain, but the solution, they probably haven't thought about the same constraints that the developers who design the APIs and the developers who hear all of the customer feedback in aggregate think about. And one of the challenges of developer experience, of people helping represent the community side of an open source tool, is bridging the gap between the community feedback and the core maintainers of the product or the open source tool. And you really have to build this appreciation for both sides, and you have to represent both sides. So for example, when people are really upset with something, it's your job to take that feedback and get it back to the team in a way that is boiled down to the root problem, ideally stripping away a lot of the emotion, because let's face it, a lot of people are a little blunt with their feedback online sometimes. They forget there's humans behind the screen. Oh, yes. And then on the inverse, a lot of those people don't understand the constraints of the system. They don't understand why you built that feature. And in their defense, they don't have the knowledge. So they're going to make some assumptions based on what they know. And it's your job to help bridge the gap in the communication backward. So you go to the team and you ask, it seems like Next.js has a lot of these small APIs, like generate metadata, generate static params, all of these like headers, cookies. Why do we have all of these different APIs? Is there a reason for this? And what does it have to do with the overall architecture of the framework? Because, you can see from an outsider's point of view, that might feel really overwhelming. Do I need to learn all these APIs? Is that required for me to build an app? And I have to sit with the team, myself, Delba, and others have to really ingest that and think about how do we teach people the reasons why we've made those design decisions and help them maybe not always agree with it, but at least understand the constraints of the system. And a lot of the time it comes down to things that are hard to explain, but once hopefully you find the right explanation for it, people understand the vision and the direction for where we're headed with the framework.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's like, you have put it in a very nice way where you have to sort of bridge that gap because you have a team that's really hardworking. And I also personally feel like because of Next.js being like the early adopters of a lot of the features of React, I would say that a lot of the feedback has been going towards Next.js, but I feel like that's also because, Next.js was the first adopter. So when something is early, there's going to be feedback, there's going to be frustrations. I also feel like going from the pages router to the app router, there's also like it's a huge change, right? Like a lot of developers had to shift their mental model. And I feel like Next.js definitely got a little bit of heat for it. But again, that's not fair because it was, Next.js was the early adopter. But yeah, I think you're right. I think like having that bridge and that feedback is like really important so that both sides, like you have a team that's thriving and pushing features, but then the community of developers are also supported as well.
Yeah, it's there are definitely pros and cons to adopting the latest React features and really partnering closely with the React team. I'll start with the cons, but they're heavily outweighed by the pros. So the cons, like you said, is sometimes the first time developers are getting exposure to these new patterns or these new ways of building, the first time they're getting introduced to this mental model of React being on the client and the server, which is very different than the React of 5 years ago, maybe the last time they picked it up for a project. The first time they're being exposed to that is in a framework like Next.js. So naturally, their frustration or their confusion is actually coming out a lot more on Next.js versus React. And I think that's one of the cons, but it's okay because the pros heavily outweigh that con. And I think in general, we had to make this decision, now let's call it like 3 years ago, when we were trying to figure out the next evolution of Next.js. Because if we're not listening to customer feedback, if we're not listening to developer feedback and evolving the framework, then you stagnate. And once you stagnate, then eventually there'll be another tool that does it better. So it's important to be constantly innovating, to be constantly improving and solving real pain points. And I think a lot of people, maybe who haven't been around in the community for as long, forget that, or just weren't here at the time, there were probably 15 or 20 pain points that were really, really hard to solve and were all kind of related that required a broader architecture change to the Next.js pages router. And we had been exploring options for a while and ultimately had to make this bet of the React team has some ideas about where they want to take this server and client model in the future. We can kind of go all in and go on this wild ride and kind of build some of this together with them and learn in public, build in public. Or we could build, a 1.1 instead of a 2.0. Just a 1.1, it's a little bit better of the pages router model. We could add streaming there, we could make data fetching more granular. We could, do some other things to make it a little bit better type safety. Sure, we could do that. But we also thought that the pages router generally was working pretty well, and we wanted to take a big swing. And the big swing required a lot more work and a lot more upfront investment in building out a lot of the APIs, but also finding the right seams between React and Next.js such that the rest of the React community outside of Next.js can also benefit from a lot of the work that we did. So in a very non-obvious way, you can think about, let's call it 3 years of work that Next.js was helping the React core team with. Obviously, they did the majority of the work here. Now make its way back to client-side React as well. So with React 19 now stable, you start to notice there's this same programming model across the client and the server. And a lot of this was incubated by testing things in the server world with Next.js, and then also testing things in the client world with applications at Meta and their own custom server framework or community libraries that were using client React and community packages. And all of that, I think, in my opinion, has helped kind of uplift the entire React ecosystem, not just Next.js, but other frameworks, other libraries, as the result of a lot of work over multiple years.
And I completely agree. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for all your work and all, the work in general that your team has done or teams have done. It's incredible. And I always mention it in videos. Yeah, this is frustrating, but it is such a hard change. You're not just supporting even a few 100,000, like probably millions of developers at this point with how much Next.js has grown. And it's not easy to please even a few, but if not like a million, right? So yeah, thank you so much. First, I want to definitely acknowledge that effort for sure. But I also want to sort of say that I think that it's going to be so much better for the developers that are starting to learn React today.
Yeah.
Why? Because they don't have, for lack of a better word, I would say a lot of information that we've had, like a historic knowledge, that we've had as developers, right? Over the years, that we went from class components to then functional to then hooks to then, all of that fun stuff, from then client to then server, and now both. Like, there's a lot that happened over the past few years, and we have seen the evolution of it. But I feel like developers that start today, they are at an advantage because all they need to know is when you start off with Next.js, the docs say, pick a framework. You pick a framework, you start off with Next.js, and if you do everything on the server by default, you want interactivity, great. Add a use client directive on top and go from there. And I think that knowledge itself is so much simpler. We wouldn't be here if the Next.js team and the React team didn't work in collaboration to make it happen. And I agree, like all the other frameworks are definitely benefiting from it for sure. So I definitely see the work. So thank you so much for doing it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think one thing that we've learned, certainly on the Next.js team from the React team, is designing and building APIs, not for your existing users, but for future users. And it's kind of a mind-bending concept because you would think, well, of course I want to bring everybody who's currently using the framework along for the ride. And we do, we definitely want to do that. But when you're designing APIs from scratch, we're thinking about the next million developers. So while there's, a million active developers of Next.js right now, in the future, there'll be 2 or 3 or more, and we want them to have intuitive APIs when they're learning it for the first time. And our job is then, once we know the vision of where we want to head to and something that we feel like is approachable and understandable for new developers picking it up, it's our job to smooth the curve between those who are already using the framework to help them understand why we're making the changes we're making, make it easy for them to upgrade and bring them along for the ride. And I think that's where a lot of the developer experience wins can be had.
Yeah, for sure. And you're totally right. I feel like if the new adopters, they adopt the new patterns, I feel like you're enabling more developers, right? Which is like a really good strategy in general. So on a lighter note, I want to know, what does a day in the life of Lee Rob look like? Now, I'm all about morning routines, productivity hacks, all of that. But I'm always curious for someone as productive as you are, and you always have a smile on your face, your responses on Twitter, threads, it's amazing. So thank you for doing that. I would love to know, what does your day in a life look like, and give us all your hacks because we really want to know.
Yeah, well, my day has recently changed quite a bit because I'm a new dad. My daughter is,
Congratulations.
thank you. My daughter's 3 months old. So I now have a general time when I want to wake up and go to bed at the same time. I didn't used to be like that. I like to stay up until like 1 a.m. because I'm a night person. Not anymore. Nope. I'm waking up early. I'm getting up and working out, a few times a week and having some coffee, trying to kick things off in the morning, have my work day, and then spend time at night with the family before putting her down for bed and kind of wrapping up. In terms of like productivity hacks or things that I like to do, honestly, my general feeling on a lot of work productivity is the easiest and most simple system is usually the best one. So I have an Apple Notes to-do list. It works pretty well. I do still like to use Linear, and I kind of put all the teamwork tasks in there. There's kind of a transfer between Apple Notes where I'm like jotting down ideas, and then I actually like, okay, this is the thing we're going to do. Let's plan it and put it into Linear, and I can wake up and look at my board and see the tasks that are in progress, not only for me, but across the team. But in terms of simple systems, the same thing applies to keeping momentum and continuously iterating and shipping and working in public. The simplest option there is just make it smaller. Ship something smaller. So rather than building, a whole new complex application, build and ship one feature. Or rather than restructuring all of the docs, what can I ship today to make the docs better? And then I'll iterate and improve on it a little bit more. And I think for developers in creative fields, which is what I think of developer experience like, development at large is creative to me. There's art and science, but developer experience in particular with writing and videos, you have an opinion about what good looks like, and nobody else is going to tell you what you think good looks like. So you are your own biggest critic for actually getting something out the door. And the only way you keep the momentum up and just release and ship things is to ship something, see what people say, and you look at it and you're like, that was good, but I feel like I could have done this one thing better, and then take that into the next one and make it 1% better on every single iteration. That philosophy, I think, has helped me a lot. And after doing that for 4.5 years at Vercel, I now find that when there's long, extended stretches of time where I'm not creating, I feel it deeply where I need to put something out and just like get the flywheel moving again, because it's how I feel like I keep a pulse on what the community wants, how I keep a pulse on what Next.js needs to do, and also just build relationships with everyone in the React and Next.js communities.
Awesome. I love that. I'm glad we share the same philosophy. I feel like I'm trying to grow my YouTube channel, and I guess like transitioning, being a tech educator, I'm learning every day. But every time I don't want to ship something, I'm always like, is it 1% better than the previous one? What did I do? If it is, yes, that's it. I'm going to publish it, and so on. So yeah, I think what you said made a lot of sense. Just ship it and get the feedback from the community by working in public, building relationships, and so on. So yeah, I think keeping it simple is definitely the way to go for sure as well.
Generally, this is my philosophy. If you don't look back on your previous work and cringe a little bit, then you're not improving.
I cringe a lot. So
I look back and I watch some of my old stuff and I cringe a lot. And it's not that it's necessarily bad. It's fine. But man, if I could go back and change, I would do this different. I learned about this approach to make my video better, my audio better, or I teach in this philosophy that just seems to resonate better, and how I progressively disclose topics and so on and so forth. So 1% iterations, 365 days a year.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely leads to a lot of compounding gains for sure. Yeah. So I would say like the biggest hesitation that I have found personally when it comes to I would say adopting Next.js and even Vercel to an extent for sure as well, is that people have existing cloud platforms that they're heavily tied to, especially like enterprises and so on. And even when I wanted to pitch Next.js, I got pushback from two companies where I was at, where like we already have our existing cloud provider. We don't want to switch immediately to Next.js now. We want to stick to what we're doing. And at the time it was Gatsby or something, which I personally felt like Next.js would have made things so much better. But definitely there are so many opinions in the company and so on. And I'm sure, based on my experience, I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of companies are hesitant to go towards adopting a new framework is, just like the whole cloud integration and what they're heavily tied to and so on. So I guess like for folks that are listening today and want to switch to Next.js and want to start using the cool framework in their toolkit, what would you recommend? What should their adoption strategy be? Is there something that could help them make a pitch to their companies? And yeah, how can they convince their bosses?
Yeah, well, if your current technology stack is working well, don't change it. Leave it. You don't need to move to Next.js. You don't need to change frameworks. I think there is a certain percentage of applications where things are fine, everything's fine. They can kind of leave it as is on their current tech stack and everything is great. Generally, what I see though is a lot of people are in the process of transitioning technology stacks. And this is where they get into an evaluation of what is the right tool for my team. And this is anywhere from they're on a Net and jQuery application and they're looking to move to something that's more actively maintained in the community. Not to say that they aren't as maintained. There's more of a momentum, I think, in the community in hiring around React developers. So it's probably easier for them to staff a workforce that has the skills that they need to build the next version of their application. And also, if they're trying to build a more dynamic application, a lot of the new features that modern frameworks provide help them evolve from a very static website that's just displaying some text to building a new version of their web application. It has login, it's personalized to the visitor. It has a little bit more of a complex user interface, more than something that's kind of just the same experience for every single user. So generally, when I see people evaluating Next.js, there is some decision, there's some pain that their business is feeling, that their developers are feeling. Their web performance isn't good enough, measured by Core Web Vitals. Their developers are suffering from slow build times, or they're suffering from a poor DX while they're trying to work with the tools that they're using. So they're looking for more modern options, and they're trying to figure out what tools in the community have gravity, have momentum, are actively maintained, both for things like fixing security vulnerabilities, for being able to contribute fixes upstream into open source, and so on and so forth. And I think for a lot of people, that's how they find their way towards Next.js, because there's a large number of React developers and JavaScript and TypeScript developers in the community who are in the job market, who are looking to help build software. So for a lot of those folks, they land on Next.js as an option, and they're evaluating, and they're trying to figure out if it makes the most sense for their business. Generally, the way that I pitch Next.js is it is a very general purpose tool to help you build high quality web applications. If you need to build more of a kind of static page for one part of your application, and for another part of your application, you want to have a dynamic personalized dashboard based on the visitor, and then maybe for another part of your application, you want to have periodically updating data, you can kind of mix and merge all of that inside of one framework, where you're still using the same programming model in React across the client and the server, and you get to write it in, I would say, the world's most popular type-safe language now, in TypeScript. So you're using, I guess, as a side tangent here, in comparing where we're at right now versus 10 years ago in the state of front-end development, there was a lot of fatigue in tools changing, and you still hear people talk about it a little bit. But 10 years further, a lot of tools have really standardized, and there isn't really that fatigue anymore. TypeScript is pretty commonly used. ESLint is very commonly used. Prettier is very commonly used. Even some of the lower level libraries, there's very good options that are stable and well maintained and have been around for a long time. I mean, Tailwind just continues to grow in popularity as a great option for styling, and so on and so forth. And that doesn't mean that there's not new things innovating, but there's a lot of really safe choices. Just like Next.js has been around for 2016, it's been here for some time and continues to have the most active development it's ever had. So when I'm pitching people to use Next.js, if they're evaluating React and they're trying to build a dynamic application, I think it makes a lot of sense for them. To get to the second part of your question around infrastructure, the majority of Next.js applications are taken and put on their own infrastructure, their own self-hosted servers somewhere, their own cloud infrastructure, their own Kubernetes instance. And from Vercel's point of view, that's great. I don't think every Next.js application in the world should work on Vercel. If you want to self-host it somewhere else, that's awesome. And I've made some videos recently showing people how to do that and make that as easy as possible. But for a percentage of those people, they want to spend more time building their product and less time configuring the dials of their infrastructure. And for them, I think Vercel is a great fit. And it's going to automate a lot of the work that they needed to do and just allow them to focus on the product code and hire more product engineers to do front end and product work. And I think Next.js is a really good fit for that.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I also feel like Vercel is just so easy to get started with for anyone, really. I have all my products on Vercel, and I recently upgraded to a pro plan, so I cannot complain at all. I think it's been working really well so far with all the logging and stuff like that too. Yeah. I was really impressed, I should say, for sure.
The other thing to mention, I think I don't talk about as much because I spend most of my time talking about Next.js, but Vercel as a platform is just trying to make it easier to build web applications. And of course, also, I personally prefer using Next.js for most things. But from a Vercel standpoint, we've built a platform that works really great if you use Next.js, but you can also use other frameworks if you prefer to build a client-side only application, if you prefer to just use HTML, if you want to use Python, like you can use pretty much whatever you want, and it's still supported on our platform, and you can take advantage of a lot of the other features that we've built around automating infrastructure, even though I spend most of my time talking about Next.js.
Yeah, for sure. I think the docs are there for deploying any other framework on Vercel as well. And yeah, your video about VPS is definitely one of my favorites because I think we needed that for a very long time. And yeah, it was a great video in general that I'll definitely link somewhere in the video as well for other people to check out.
Yeah, that was a fun one to make because I don't know if a lot of people had known that I have a lot of experience doing that type of work in the past. In my last company, I was doing Next.js on Kubernetes, and I've done some of the DevOpsy type work before, enough to appreciate it and also to never want to do that again for the work that I'm doing for my company. Yeah. I think there's a big difference between the work that people find fun as a hobby, and a lot of people find managing servers and tweaking infrastructure and doing DevOps stuff as a hobby really fun. And I just think that for a lot of people, for their day job, they probably don't want to be on call for that, hacky script that I wrote to deploy to a $4 VPS. So there's a little bit of a balance here. What might work really well for your side project with no users is a little bit different than something that's making all the revenue for your business.
Are you basically talking about me? I wrote a hacky script in the past. I feel like you're talking about my past experience here.
Hey, I love a good hacky script, and with AI, it's even easier to create hacky scripts now. So if your goal is to minimize cost as cheap as possible, you can, of course, use Vercel's free plan. But if you're deploying a bunch of stuff on a $4 VPS, that's great. That's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And creating a script on V0 would be also great. I've been using that a lot. I love it so much. Okay, so one of the biggest change that's coming up in Next.js, it's already here, but I would say in an experimental phase, right? Where is partial pre-rendering. I love it so much. I think that's where we should have been, but I know I read Sebastian's blog post on the evolution of how we got here. And it's such a great blog post that I'll link somewhere as well that everyone should read to give you that historic context for how things have evolved. I'm so excited about partial pre-rendering in general, but how do you envision that rolling into Next.js in the future? I guess it has already started, and I have a branch running where I'm using partial pre-rendering for my own custom course platform, which we'll talk about. But curious to know about your thoughts for what's your vision for that? Yeah,
one thing on the development of partial pre-rendering that I think might not be as well understood is it seems obvious in retrospect that this approach is just strictly better than kind of how it worked before. But the only way that we get here is through trying different approaches, getting feedback from the community, listening to their feedback and kind of iterating on that. If we would have just went into a lab and tried a bunch of things and kind of poured things into our test tubes and tried to build up this concoction, we probably wouldn't have ended up with partial pre-rendering, and we would have never shipped the app router. So
No.
there's always this trade-off of how much change are you willing to take to allow you to evolve on a better model in the future. And I think partial pre-rendering is one big change. I think the use cache work that we're doing to simplify caching is another. And they're related in some ways, separate but related. Both, I would say, are really great destinations that we've arrived that were only possible through multiple iterations and community feedback. So with partial pre-rendering, for example, at some point here in the future, we'll be able to mark it as stable in a minor release, probably. And it will be still something that you would opt into. And in the future major release, we think that this will be something that we would turn on by default. Generally, the thing that I really like about partial pre-rendering is the way we've built the app router, the way we're taking advantage of things like React Suspense, is you can start writing code today that kind of prepares you for this future using all the stable features and helping you build a better application, thinking about your loading states and thinking about how you design your data fetching architecture. And when partial pre-rendering is ready, you basically just turn it on and don't need to really do anything else. It's going to look at your application and look at all the different parts in your component tree where you have suspense boundaries and try to pre-render as much as possible of that initial page render. And you'll be able to then dial up or dial down the amount of dynamic content you want to run or the amount of content that really shouldn't change and should be included in the initial pre-render. And that's something that'll work, regardless of where you deploy your Next.js application, regardless of how you want to configure it. You can already get this today when you pre-render your application. Even when you're hosting on a Next.js server, the server still serves up that initial pre-render of your application that can be generated during the build process. So I'm looking forward to partial pre-rendering being stable. I think it simplifies some parts of how we teach the mental model of Next.js while having a ton of benefits towards improving the performance generally of applications. And I think it's going to be,
For sure. And yeah, I'm really excited about it being stable for sure, because I feel like it is, to me, it feels like the future of building apps with Next.js. And I would say the future for a lot of other frameworks, adopting that specific method too, right? Because I think why opt into page level rendering, right? When you can opt into specific dynamic versus static levels and you get the benefits of it all. All right. So the next part is probably a little selfish, I must admit. But also I feel like every single company I've worked at has a specific use case where, and again, we just spoke about partial pre-rendering, which is a perfect use case for this. But until then, I feel like Next.js just gives so much out of the box in terms of performance. And I would love to sort of hear your perspective on, let's say, as you know already, like recently I built a custom course platform because I was tired of the existing ones and I wanted to give a custom learning experience for what I'm teaching. In this case was Next.js. So let's say I have 500 lessons, which is a lot of static content, but I also have dynamic interactivity and so on. A lot of applications are like that, right? Where you have a lot of staticness, but then there's obviously dynamic interactivity and so on. But it's also behind a user login, right? Because there's some sort of a user that has to log in to access the content. But there's still so much static content. So what would you say, how would you approach this problem in terms of using Next.js? And we can use whatever, doesn't matter experimental or not, even if you have to use cache, which I'm really excited about as well. But I would love to hear your perspective for how you would improve the performance of this type of application.
Yeah, so I think the best place to start from, again, we're talking about an application where there's the majority of the content behind a user login. So the user needs to be authenticated to view the content.
Yep.
I think it's worth first setting the stage for a lot of people that server rendering, so going to the server and generating some HTML and sending it back to the browser, doing pure server rendering with no caching can actually be very fast today. The speed of networks is only getting better, and databases can be very fast when done correctly. And when all things are right, you can build very, very fast server rendered applications. The challenge is you can also make them very slow. You can also make them not as reliable when there are issues with your database or any third-party API that you're relying on. So the goal of a framework is to try to help you optimize and minimize the amount of things that could slow down your application. So you'll hear people say, well, it's behind a login, so do I really need server rendering? Do I really need to do all that extra stuff? Can't I just put up a login page and then do the rest on the client side? And generally, I think what they're saying when they say that is, can't I just design and build my application in a way where I only need to think about the client environment and just not have to worry about the server environment? But the trick there, and what a lot of people don't realize, when they say that, they're coming from a place usually where those were two different teams. There's I work on the front end, it's somebody else's problem, and I have an API that I call at my big co, and at big co, another team maintains the API, and that's what talks to the database. And maybe I do some stuff across both, but they're these two separate worlds because I've got 10 different applications that read from the API and 5 mobile apps. The reality is that that's true for some applications, but there is a lot of applications where you just simply don't need to have that level of separation. And you instead want to think about designing features across the client and the server. And if you do that, if you think product first, which is why sometimes I talk about product engineering and I describe myself as a product engineer, you are going to have an interface. It's going to need to talk to a database. These are all things within the control of you designing the feature. And if you have tools that work across the client and the server, you might architect the application in a way where you have to write a lot less code. Why would I go build the separate API if I can build that into my application where I'm using the same programming model, the same language? I'm still writing in TypeScript. A lot of the time that separate API is in, Go or Java or something else. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with that. And sometimes you can really squeak out the performance of those APIs to do really amazing stuff. You can go pretty far with a Node.js API as well. And I think a lot of folks deploy Node.js APIs. This is even before we get to caching.
Yeah.
This is just talking about a raw server rendered application, goes to the server, fetches things from your database, and returns HTML. So you've got your login page. Maybe you are putting your checks for authentication on the page and you get past your authentication check and now you want to serve up some content to your visitor. Well, you could put a loading spinner on the page and do your fetching on the client side. But the problem is that you've already sent back a response from the server to the client to show the loading spinner. And now the client is the one that's initiating the call to say, okay, let's go get some information. So now the client has to go back to the server n number of times, right? Because unless you have a perfectly optimized application, you're probably going to have multiple APIs in there or multiple hooks that are fetching information. And you've now entered in a world of n number of client round trips. And again, it's not necessarily wrong, but it's very easy to get into a state where you have a degraded user experience, where you're, especially for folks trying to build a global application, where in some instances, it's just very slow for the network latency to go from one location to the other many different times. Now, again, in a perfect environment, your server rendering in one shot can be really fast, but when you start to add things in the client, it can get out of control pretty quickly. So ideally, you don't want to do a loading spinner. You want to send as much of the application shell that does not change as you can in the initial response. And this is really what partial pre-rendering is trying to help you do. You can certainly do this kind of in a custom bespoke way, but it's a lot harder to do. What partial pre-rendering allows you to do is still write your application in the way generally you've been writing your React application. And then the compiler during the build is going to generate that shell for you based on the code that you've defined in a way that code that engineer 1 writes doesn't conflict with code that engineer 2 writes, because it's all based on the components. So even better than the loading spinner is the shell of the application. And then you're defining at the code level the different holes on the page where you have the dynamic content. Now, the rejection to that might say, yeah, but my application is so fast. Why would I go through all of that work when I could just put a loading spinner and return it in 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds? And the answer is great. For some people, that's going to work fantastic. The reality is, at a certain point, it just doesn't scale. There's going to be enough code or enough client round trips where that ends up with a degraded experience. So maybe you don't start with this approach I'm describing, but you will likely end up somewhere where you will need a solution like this. So you've got an app, majority of the page or as much of the page as possible that you can render the shell, and then you're leaving holes for the dynamic content. And the key thing here that makes this experience work great is being able to then stream in the dynamic content. So your server is kind of continuously sending pings, continuously sending chunks of information over the network to your client without your client having to download this really heavy bundle of JavaScript code that has to get parsed and executed and ran on potentially a lower powered device and, in a different environment. So streaming can be really beneficial for that. And you kind of just get it out of the box when you're using the Next.js app router and other frameworks who are embracing kind of a streaming first world. It does come with constraints, right? It does come with trade-offs when you're building an application streaming first, but we think that the streaming model is so impactful for helping you improve core web vitals, improve the user experience of your application, that we think it should be the default way that you build web applications. And that's why the Next.js app router defaults to it, and you cannot opt out of streaming. You're always streaming inside of your application unless you build an application that can be pre-rendered entirely. So this is effectively a static site generator. Every page can be generated statically. So long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I think about it.
No, I think that thank you so much for sharing that, because I feel like this thought process is what I was looking for when I asked you this question, because there are trade-offs that we are going to make every step of the way, right? And I think making those trade-offs and hearing you talk about it, I think is going to help a lot of developers listening to this conversation. One last segment, and now we're just going to switch gears and have some fun with the rapid fire segment.
Okay.
I hope you did not open up this specific section I sent you.
didn't.
That's great, because I said don't open it. But I'm going to ask you a series of quick questions, and you have to answer as fast as you can.
Okay.
Again, no pressure, just fun. It's going to be very, very easy questions. Except, okay, coffee or tea?
Coffee.
What is your favorite coding language?
Probably TypeScript, but Python is a close second.
Ooh, I did not expect you to say Python. Okay, who is your favorite teammate at Vercel, and what makes them your favorite? This is so controversial.
I don't have one favorite, but I'm very fortunate to have a team of great people that I get to work with.
Good answer. If you could have dinner with any tech figure, who would it be and why?
Good question. I feel like a conversation with Jeff from Amazon, Jeff B.
Oh my
I feel like
God,
that'll be an
wow.
interesting one.
Yeah, for sure. How can we add Next.js? Or maybe Amazon already uses Next.js. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Amazon uses Next for Audible, the book application.
Oh, that's great.
Some of their other properties use Next as well, so that's pretty fun.
Oh, that's awesome. So that will be a very interesting conversation. What's your favorite React 19 feature?
Probably actions, and not just server actions, but client actions as well.
What's your guilty pleasure TV show?
My wife and I watch Survivor every season, every episode, and
I love that.
It's really fun.
Yeah. No, mine too. I love it so much. If you had to pick one feature of Next.js that you absolutely love, what would it be and why?
Honestly, the simplicity of data fetching with server components is something that continues to impress me with how easy it is. It's probably that, yeah.
And did you have fun during this interview on my channel?
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for just this rapid fire segment. I feel like this is a fun way to get to know you as a person. But yeah, that's all I had for today. I guess as next steps, or like, where can people find you? Is there something you would like to share with everyone? Anything big and bold? Now is the time to share it.
Yeah, you can find me at leerob.com, and Next.js 15 was recently released, so upgrade, give it a shot, and let me know what you think.
Yeah, Next.js 15.1 as well, right? A couple of days ago. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Lee, for being a part of my channel. As you know, I'm a big fan of your work, so if there's anything I can do to help you in the community, please let me know as well. But yeah, thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, I appreciate all the work you're doing in the community, so thank you.
Yeah, awesome. All right, bye everyone.